Now we go into chapter 6 in our study. And the inquiry points or questions. I think last time we have misnumbering. We're going to correct that. We're going to follow up on the covenant of Abraham, and we see how did it continue. What happened with the covenant when it goes to his children, grandchildren? How did they see that? It's very important to understand that the covenant is for Abraham and his family. So how his children will take the covenant? Will they take it seriously? Will they take it personally? Will they not take it at all? How are they going to deal with it? So if we finish talking about the covenant with Abraham in chapter 22, right? Genesis 22. So from 22 all the way to end of the book of Genesis, what happened to those covenants? How did it go? Did we have another covenant? No. The next covenant will come in Exodus. And Exodus, starting in chapter 3 and 4, when God meets Moses and in the burning bush, he's going to make a new covenant with Israel. So let's talk about the covenant with Abraham children, how he's going to lead. Yes. Is it shared? Okay. So the title of this chapter is The Covenant with Abraham Continued. That's from Genesis 23, immediately after 22, all the way to the end of Genesis, which is 50 chapters. Notice that we are spending six sessions on Genesis. Why is that? Why do we, Abuna, out of the almost 40 books of Old Testament, we spend 6 out of 16 sessions only on one book? Why? Because that one book has 3 out of the 6 covenants. 3. You take 1 out, that's the new covenant. We'll talk about it in the New Testament. Then you have 3 out of 5. We definitely need to spend more time in Genesis than any other book. Because if we don't understand Genesis, the rest of the Bible will be meaningless. It's just a bunch of stories. You don't know exactly why they are there and what happened, why we picked those stories, because they relate to the 3 covenants in Genesis and definitely more to the one in Exodus that we're going to look into next time. Inquiry question. What is the meaning of Genesis 15, 13 to 16? That's the vision of Abraham. This is important. It's an important prophecy that God had foretold his friend Abraham about. The second point of inquiry, is there a spiritual analogy in Abraham's calling? You bet. There is a lot of spirituality in the calling of Abraham. How did the children and grandchildren of Abraham carried on the covenant? That's the major part of what we're going to do today. You have children, you have Isaac and Ishmael. And then you have Jacob and Esau. And Jacob had 12 sons and 1 daughter that we know of. How each of those individuals handled the covenant of Abraham. They are now tied as a family to God. How are they going to carry on this relationship? Under this, how can we understand the blessing right in Genesis 27? This is a very important chapter. 27, after 22, go 27. It's a really very, very significant chapter. We might take pieces from it today. Why was Joseph both favored and hated? What's the point in relationship to the covenant? Why the story of Joseph that you all know? The boy in the coat of many colors, very loved by his father, but at the same time he is very hated to his guts by his brothers. And the last point of inquiry, what is the significance of Jacob blessing his children? Why was Judah assigned the royal rule? We're going to look into that. So we already said the 3 promises: nation, royal, and priest, right? Nation with a king and priest. So those things are assigned, given to Abraham, to have king who rules over all the nations, to have priest that serves all the nations, and to have people as the number of the stars of heaven. Now, we were supposed to read the last 25 chapters. Let's start with the first point. What's the meaning of Genesis 15, 13 to 16? I always, whenever I read the book of Genesis, this these verses, these 3 verses touched me very specifically. I'll tell you why. Look at what God said here. This is exactly when Abraham cut the animals, chapter 15 at the end, and actually God walked through them in a pillar of fire and pillar of smoke. What did God say after he finished walking through it? Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves. And afterward, they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, after 400 years, your descendants will come back here where Abraham was. For the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Why is this piece very special? What's God saying to Abraham here? Now, Abraham had not yet gotten Isaac even. There's no Isaac. And God is telling him what? He's telling him you have a very big number of people. And yes, I'll give them this land. This is the promise, that covenant that he's making about the land in that chapter 15. And then what? He said they will be strangers in a foreign land. What kind of foreign land? He didn't tell him where. And we know later the foreign land would be, where would the Israelites go and be slaves? In Egypt. So in Egypt, he's telling him about, listen to this, he's telling him about Joseph being sold, but in a very short way. Joseph being sold, envied by his brothers, sold to the Ishmaelites, taken to Egypt. There he becomes a great man, and he invites his family, the family of Jacob, to come to Egypt, where they would live there for 400 years. He's telling him all that in one statement. And then he will tell him of the change of circumstances. Instead of being the favorite family in Egypt, they will be slaves. And he's telling him that at one point, they will get out of there. Not only will give him a specific, something very specific, he says, will great riches. They will come out of there after I judge that nation with great possessions. He speaks about a very small detail. Why? I think Abraham is interested to know that his, if I tell you that your great grandchildren will be slaves, that would shock you. But then I will tell you, no, they will be freed. But then you're going to say, slaves freed? How are they going to live? So God is giving him the comfort and say that they will come out with great positions. Something is going to happen. The night they will come out, that they will have to be rich. So this is what will happen. And God is telling him that. And then he's saying, but you don't have to worry about all that. You will die before that, very long time before. Why? Abraham's going to say, why? Why do they have to go anywhere? We are in the promised land. Why they can't live here? Just stay here. And listen to this. God is saying to him, because the sin of the Amorites, who are the Amorites, is one of the descendants. Actually, they are the most powerful of all the Canaanites. Amorites were the greatest kingdom among all the Canaanites in the place. So people knew about the Amorites from a very far distance. But he's saying to him, their sins are not yet complete. Okay, what does that mean? Anybody knows? That the sins of the Amorite, the owners of the land now, is worthy of kicking them, but not yet. They will reach that. When are they going to reach that? For me to take over their land. And God said, those people that you live with are very sinful, and they are going to reach a point where they need to be kicked out of their land. And that point is by 400 years from them, from your descendants going down to Egypt. What is God saying to Abraham? That's a lot. I would say this is something that no one can expect from even a regular friend. God is giving him the future, and he's giving him actually the reason for why he is doing what he is doing. Let's see why we lost this. Okay. So this is a very specific piece. I want us to kind of keep that in mind. Genesis 15, 13 to 16 is a friend speaking to a friend and explaining to him secrets. God had done this many times with Abraham. One day he's going to go and burn Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, shall I hide from Abraham? And as if it's saying, like, should I hide from my friend what I'm going to do? What's the business of Abraham? Lot is there. He might be worried about Lot. So he gave him a chance to intercede for the city, Sodom and Gomorrah. Same thing here. At the same time, God is making the covenant of land and nation with Abraham. The fulfillment of the promise was revealed to him. God spoke of the sojourning of the family of Jacob in Egypt. The details of how they would go to Egypt was not given. Later, we saw the unfolding of God's plan in Joseph's mission. God spoke of the Israelites' hardship in Egypt, of their exodus with great possessions. God told Abraham their final arrival in Canaan in the fourth generation. God told Abraham the reason for this temporary detour is that the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached the full measure. God had known that in 400 years from the time of his covenant with Abraham, it would take 400 years for Amorites to do enough evil worthy of their expulsion from the land. You understand? This is like very special, a special treatment. And all of that because Abraham trusted God. Listen to this. In God's mind, he's a very faithful person, God is. If you trust me, in return, I trust you. How do you do that? You trust me, I'll tell you my secrets. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. This is how God is working with Abraham. Here, in one short prophecy, the Lord told Abraham of the summary of all the events from the covenant with him all the way to the events in the book of Joshua. That means the rest of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, all the way to the entering of the promised land. The Lord told Abraham of many things, including his judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham was truly a close friend of God. Very true. That's what a covenant is. A family member. The second point, which is a smaller point, is what do we learn? It can be like chapters can be written on this, books can be written on this. What do we learn from the journey of Abraham with God? In the covenant with Abraham, there are many aspects that can be looked at as model for intimacy with God. First, it is God who initiated the relationship through calling Abraham. This initial step established the covenant on God, not on man. It was God that calls. He is the foundation. He's the rock. Later, when a person is tested, if Abraham is tested, they can trust in God and not in their own strength. If I started, I would doubt was I like a moment of like a slingshot approach. I just give it a chance, and then if I don't feel like it, then it stops. No, it was God who started, and when God starts, I am assured that this is very firm. Faith is trusting God to always do what God promised. Second, the human participation was in detaching from all earthly bonds, family, country, land, and even his only son. He had to keep everything out, and God has to be always his only goal. The great ascetics means here the monks who lived in the deserts, or even people who live in the city and they detach themselves from all desires and lusts and attachments, followed the same example and lived as sojourners, exercising fasting, vigils, and poverty to gain closer intimacy with God. There are times when the friend of God has to go through a darkness of faith where he can't see anything. Like we saw in chapter 15, what Abraham felt. What did he feel? Did God abandon me? Did I misunderstand? Was I misled? Was something wrong with this? I really don't know. It seems like there's nothing. I don't hear any voices. I don't see any things. My old wife is barren. She cannot have any children. I'm getting older. I'm not going to have any children. What do you call that? It's a night of faith. You're just going by trusting God. Nothing you see, nothing you hear, nothing you can experience in your physical body that can assure you of anything. They call this the night of faith. The night of faith. or darkness of faith, where nothing seems to make sense. Only trusting God's power and love would keep the friend of God going through the darkness. Ultimately, the saints who walk the journey with will find their rest and consolation in God. They will be consoled. But after they have to go through this agony, like Jesus on the cross, why have you forsaken me? Even Christ, the Son of God, will have to go through this experience. This is the spiritual lessons. I remember I was reminded last time I said there were 3 people in the Bible that had their names given by God. Actually, I'm mistaken. There's a 4th one that was reminded. That was a 4th one. When you read the book of Genesis, we said Isaac was picked by God. The name was picked by God. Who else? We said Jesus and John the Baptist. You add Ishmael too. The angel spoke to Hagar and told her, you will call his name Ishmael. Means God listens. God hears. So 4, not 3. I might find someone else, but 3 inside the covenant, 1 outside the covenant.